My mother-in-law moved my pregnant sister-in-law into my house without consulting me so she could have her baby there. When I protested, my husband struck me and snapped, "Watch your mouth." I didn't argue or give anyone a warning. Instead, I quietly sold the property behind their backs and left for England, allowing them to deal with the consequences of their choices. $18,000. I stared at the screen of my laptop in a rented flat above a laundromat in Ealing, the cursor blinking over a line item dated 3 days before Jenna's suitcases showed up in my hallway. Transfer to D. Whitfield. 18,000 hours. Diane's name, right there in black and white, in an account I'd forgotten Mark still had access to because it used to be for the mortgage before I paid the house off outright. He hadn't just stood there and let his mother take over my house. He'd bankrolled it. I sat with that for a long time, long enough for the kettle to boil and go cold twice. I kept thinking about the crib in my office, the diapers stacked where my filing cabinet used to be, the way Diane had said stop being selfish without even turning around, like I was a child who'd interrupted the adults. I thought about the sound my own tooth made against my lip. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. I hadn't married a monster. Or I hadn't thought I had. Mark and I met at a compliance conference in Cleveland 6 years earlier, both of us bored out of our minds during a panel on regulatory reporting, and he leaned over and whispered a joke about the moderator's tie that made me laugh so hard I had to step out of the room. He remembered my coffee order after our first date. He'd cried at my grandmother's funeral, actually cried, standing next to me while I couldn't. For a long time he was, by any measure I had, a good man. The red flags, looking back, had always been about Diane. Small things I'd rationalized for years. The way he went quiet and small around her. The way "we should ask Mom" crept into decisions that had nothing to do with her. The birthday 2 years earlier when she'd shown up unannounced with a key to our apartment that neither of us remembered giving her. I told myself it was just closeness, the tight-knit family bond I'd never had with my own scattered relatives. I told myself that right up until the night his hand connected with my face and Diane's expression didn't change at all. Like some part of her had been waiting for it. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying on the plane, silently, facing the window so the man next to me wouldn't notice. What I did instead was open a new folder on my laptop and name it Evidence. I'd been a compliance analyst for 9 years before I quit to freelance, which meant I knew exactly how to build a paper trail that would survive a courtroom. I wasn't proud of how naturally it came back to me. I printed 3 years of joint statements. I cross-referenced every transfer over $1,000. I found 6 more, going back 14 months, all to Diane, totaling almost $41,000. Home repairs that were never done. A loan that was never repaid. A wire 2 days after my grandmother's funeral, which was the same week Mark had told me we couldn't afford to fix the water heater. I hadn't known. That was the part that made my hands shake. Not the money itself, but how easily I hadn't known. My solicitor here in London, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Anand, who'd handled my grandmother's UK trust years earlier, told me over the phone that none of this changed my ownership of the house. That had never been in question, but it changed everything else. If he's been siphoning marital funds to a third party without your knowledge, she said, that's not just a bad marriage, Claire. Depending on your jurisdiction back home, that could be financial abuse, potentially fraud, and it absolutely affects any divorce settlement. You need someone stateside who does forensic work. She gave me a name, Everett Osei, a forensic accountant in Columbus who'd testified in 4 divorce cases she'd cross-referenced with U.S. colleagues. I called him that same afternoon, 8 hours behind, and read him the numbers over a bad connection while a bus idled outside my window. "Send me everything you have," he said. "Statements, screenshots, dates. If this pattern holds, we're not talking about 41,000. People who move money quietly once usually aren't doing it for the first time." He was right. It never is. Everett worked the way I imagined a surgeon might. Methodical, unhurried, uninterested in my feelings about what he found, only in whether it could be proven. He asked for 18 months of statements from every account with my name or marks on it, plus the joint tax filings, plus anything I had on Diane's finances, which was almost nothing since I'd never had reason to look. He built what he called a flow chart, a phrase that made the whole thing sound almost administrative, bloodless, which I appreciated more than I expected to. It's easier to survive betrayal when someone hands you a spreadsheet instead of a story. "I do this for a living," he told me on our second call, "and I'll be honest, the emotional part isn't my department, but I've seen enough of these to tell you something for free. The spouse who finds one hidden transfer almost never finds only one. Money leaves a trail because people are lazy about covering it, especially when they don't think anyone's looking. You should prepare yourself for more than 41,000. I told him I understood. I didn't. Not really, not yet. Understanding came later, in pieces, the way it always does. Mark's texts kept coming even after I blocked his number because he found new numbers, a coworker's phone, a burner app, an email from an address I didn't recognize with the subject line, "Please." I didn't answer any of it. I forwarded every single message to Priya without reading past the first line, because I'd learned by then that if I read the whole thing, I'd start negotiating with a version of him that didn't exist anymore. Diane tried a different approach. She called my mother. My mother, to her credit, called me laughing. "She told me you abandoned your husband and his poor pregnant sister in their time of need," she said. I asked her since when was Jenna's baby your responsibility, and she hung up on me. I laughed too. The first real laugh I'd had in 11 days. It didn't last. 2 weeks after I landed, Priya forwarded me a letter from Mark's newly hired attorney, a man named Russell Cade, out of Columbus. It accused me of unilaterally disposing of marital property and abandoning the marriage under fraudulent pretenses, and it requested that I return no less than half the proceeds of the sale within 30 days or face litigation. I read it twice, then I read it a third time, because something about the phrase fraudulent pretenses made my stomach drop in a way I didn't expect. "He's trying to reframe the story," Priya said. "Make it look like you tricked him." Judges do sometimes sympathize with a spouse who feels blindsided, even when the law is not on their side. We counter hard, and we counter with documentation, not emotion. So we countered. Priya drafted a response citing the deed, the prenup, and, because Everett had by then finished his first pass through the financials, a preliminary breakdown of the transfers to Diane. $41,000 wasn't unilateral disposal of marital property. It was a fraction of what he'd already moved without telling me. Russell Cade didn't respond for 9 days. When he did, it wasn't to me. It was a phone call to Everett's office asking to informally discuss the scope of the forensic review, which Everett later told me was lawyer speak for, "Please tell me how bad this actually is before my client makes it worse." Here's the thing about escalation loops in real life. They don't announce themselves. There's no music swelling. There's just a WhatsApp notification at 4 a.m., London time from a number I didn't recognize, and Jenna's name in the message. "He's not okay. He won't eat. Mom says it's your fault. I had the baby 3 days ago, and he hasn't even come to see her. I don't know who else to tell." I sat up in bed and read it 4 times. I told myself it was manipulation. Diane putting words in Jenna's mouth, using a newborn as leverage the way she'd used everything else. I told myself Mark not showing up for his niece had nothing to do with me. I told myself all of that in the specific, deliberate way you tell yourself things you don't fully believe, testing each sentence for how much weight it could hold. My stomach didn't believe any of it. I lay awake doing the math on time zones, picturing Jenna alone in a hospital room with a baby and no father in the doorway. And by 6 a.m., I'd talked myself into calling Priya just to have someone tell me it wasn't my responsibility. She didn't quite tell me that. "You're allowed to care what happens to her," she said, "and still not owe her a rescue. Those aren't the same thing, even if it feels like it right now." I didn't answer for 2 days. I told myself that was resolve. It mostly felt like cowardice wearing Resolve's coat. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I asked Everett off the books whether anything in the financial pattern touched Jenna directly. He came back with something I hadn't expected, a transfer, 4 months before any of this started, from Mark's business account at the HVAC company he co-owned with 2 partners, to a private landlord, memo line, J. Whitfield, deposit plus first month. Jenna had had her own apartment. She'd given it up. Diane hadn't just moved her into my house because it was convenient. She'd moved her out of somewhere first. I didn't know why yet, but the shape of it, the money quietly disappearing in directions nobody asked about, was starting to look less like a mother helping her daughter, and more like something Diane had been steering for a long time, with Mark's accounts as the fuel. Diane found my mother's landline number the week before, which meant she found mine too, because I'd forwarded calls there in a moment of carelessness I regretted almost immediately. She left a voicemail I listened to standing in my mother's driveway. The phone pressed so hard to my ear it left a mark. "Claire, honey, I know you're angry. And I understand it. I do. But you have to understand what you're doing to this family. Jenna needs her brother right now. A baby needs her uncle. Whatever's going on between you and Mark, that's between you and Mark. Don't punish an innocent child for it." I told myself she believed what she was saying. I told myself grandmothers panic, that fear makes people say things they don't examine too closely. I almost called her back, some old reflex in me still wanting to smooth things over, still wanting to be the reasonable one in the room. Then I remembered her face in my kitchen the night he hit me. Not shocked, not moving, satisfied, like a scale had finally balanced the way she'd always wanted it to. I didn't call her back. My hands were steady when I deleted the voicemail, which surprised me more than the message itself had. Everett called me on a Tuesday with his voice pitched carefully flat, the way people talk when they're about to tell you something they know will hurt. "Claire, I need you to sit down for this one. The HVAC business Mark co-owned with 2 partners, Ray Dominic and Steve Okafor, had a company card. Over 18 months, Mark had run just under $30,000 through it in expenses that Everett couldn't tie to any actual job. Hotel charges in a town 2 hours from home, restaurant charges for parties of 2, a jewelry store charge for $2,200 11 months earlier that I never received so much as a gift box for. I'm not a divorce lawyer, Everett said, so I want to be careful how I say this. But if this were an affair, the pattern would look exactly like this. I didn't say anything for a while, not because I was shattered. Strangely, that part barely touched me anymore. The slap had already burned through whatever version of me still needed him to. I didn't say anything for a while, not because I was shattered. Strangely, that part barely touched me anymore. The slap had already burned through whatever version of me still needed him to be faithful. But because I understood, finally, all at once, why Diane had wanted Jenna in that house so badly, so fast, so far from wherever those hotel charges had happened. It wasn't Jenna he was seeing on those charges. Jenna was 8 months pregnant during half that window and living 40 minutes away with a man named Corey, her baby's father, who, according to a wedding photo I remembered from 2 years back, was very much still in the picture. It was someone else. And Diane, I was almost certain, knew exactly who. I flew back. Not to stay. Priya advised strongly against giving up my footing in England before the divorce was finalized under favorable jurisdiction rules, but because Everett needed an in-person deposition, and because Detective Renata Cole, a financial crimes investigator with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office who picked up the case after Ray Dominic filed his own complaint about missing business funds, wanted to interview me directly. Ray, it turned out, had noticed the discrepancies in the company card around the same time I had noticed the wire to Diane. Small businesses have a way of surfacing rot fast once someone starts looking. He hadn't known about my house, or the slap, or any of it. He'd just known his HVAC company was $30,000 lighter than it should have been, and that his business partner had gotten cagey about receipts. Detective Cole was thorough in a way that made me trust her almost immediately. 17 years with the department, the last 9 in financial crimes, a woman who took notes in a small spiral notebook instead of typing, because, she told me, typing makes people perform. Writing makes them talk. Her office was smaller than I expected, a corkboard behind her desk pinned with case numbers instead of photographs, a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Detective" that I suspected was a gift from someone who loved her. She had Ray's fraud complaint open in a folder on her desk before I even sat down, a coincidence of timing she called the kind of thing that makes a case, not breaks it. 2 people circling the same rot from different directions usually means the rot is real. I told her everything. The move-in, the slap, the sale, the wires to Diane, the company card. She didn't flinch at any of it, which somehow made it easier to say out loud than it had been to text Priya. She asked precise questions, exact dates when she could get them, whether the security system had a cloud backup separate from the local drive, whether anyone else had witnessed the assault besides Diane and Jenna. I told her Diane had watched it happen and hadn't moved. She wrote that down without comment, though her pen pressed a little harder into the page than it had for anything else. "We're going to need the security footage from your house," she said, "the one with the incident." I'd already sent it to Priya as evidence for the civil case. I hadn't thought about it as evidence for anything criminal. My stomach dropped in a different direction. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying assault is assault, Claire, whether or not you want to pursue it. That's your call, not mine. But I'd be doing you a disservice not to tell you the option exists." I told her I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 4 days. The 4th day was the day everything converged. The way it does in a story you'd swear was fiction if it hadn't happened to you. Priya emailed at 6 a.m. my time. Russell Cade had filed for an emergency hearing back in Ohio, seeking a temporary order that would freeze the proceeds from the house sale pending full accounting, arguing Mark faced financial hardship because his mother and sister were currently unhoused due to my unilateral actions. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning, Ohio morning, which meant I had roughly 18 hours to get a response filed, gather documentation, and decide once and for all whether to hand Detective Cole what she was asking for. I hadn't planned to be back in Ohio for a hearing. I'd planned to fly home to England in 4 days, after my deposition wrapped. Priya's American counterpart, a sharp Columbus family attorney named Wanda Ferris, who Priya had brought on for exactly this kind of scenario, called me at what was 1 a.m., her time, and didn't apologize for it. "If we don't show up with something concrete tomorrow," Wanda said, "a judge who doesn't know the full story could freeze those funds on sympathy alone. Pregnant sister, elderly mother, all of it plays well in a 5-minute hearing. We need the forensic report finalized tonight, and honestly, Claire, if you're willing to file the assault complaint before the hearing, it changes the entire complexion of the room. A man asking a court for financial sympathy, while a criminal complaint for domestic violence is active against him, is a very different defendant." My hands were shaking by the time I hung up, not from fear, from how fast the walls were closing in on a version of Mark I'd spent 6 years married to and apparently never actually met. I called Detective Cole at 2 a.m. "I want to file," I said. "Everything. The slap, the footage, All of it. Come in first thing, she said. I'll have the paperwork ready. I didn't sleep. I sat at my mother's kitchen table. I'd landed and gone straight there, unwilling to set foot back in the house, even though it wasn't mine to set foot into anymore. And I watched the sun come up over a street I'd grown up on. Jet lag and adrenaline make an ugly combination. My hands wouldn't stay still. I kept reorganizing the same stack of papers Wanda's paralegal had printed, squaring the edges, unsquaring them, squaring them again. Like if I just kept my fingers busy, the rest of me wouldn't have to feel anything. My mother made tea I didn't drink. At one point, she put her hand flat on my back, between my shoulder blades, and didn't say a word. And that was somehow worse than if she'd said something, because it meant she could see exactly how frightened I was. 11 days. That's how long it had been since I'd nodded and said, "You're right. I understand," to a man who'd split my lip open. 11 days, and now a judge in a wood-paneled room was going to decide in under an hour whether the last decade of my life belonged to me or got carved up on the word of a man who'd already proven he'd lie to a courtroom the same way he'd lied to me. I wasn't that woman by 8 a.m. I filed the report. Detective Cole logged the security footage into evidence, walked me through chain of custody with the same patient, unhurried thoroughness she'd used on everything else, and told me the footage alone, time-stamped, unedited, direct assault visible on camera, was, in her professional opinion, about as clean a case as I've seen in a while. By 10 a.m., I was in Wanda Ferris's office with Everett's finalized report in one hand and a certified copy of the police report in the other, watching her build a filing in real time on her laptop while a paralegal printed exhibits and labeled them with little colored tabs. Exhibit A, the deed. Exhibit B, the prenup. Exhibit C, the transfer history. Exhibit D, the security footage log. The hearing was at 9 a.m. the next day. I had less than 24 hours, and for the first time since the plane doors sealed shut in Heathrow, I understood exactly what people meant when they said their heart was in their throat. Mine wasn't racing. It was just present, loud, a fact of my body I couldn't ignore, the way the shaking in my hands wouldn't stop no matter how many times I pressed them flat against the table. The courtroom the next morning was smaller than I expected. Magistrate's court, a wood-paneled room that smelled like old carpet and coffee, maybe 30 people's worth of folding chairs, most of them empty. A radiator ticked somewhere behind the bench. Wanda sat beside me in a navy suit, her exhibits stacked and tabbed in a binder thick enough to make a sound like a small door closing when she set it down. Mark sat at the defense table in a gray suit I didn't recognize, thinner than I remembered. His eyes rimmed red in a way that used to make me want to comfort him, and now just made me tired. He glanced back once when the bailiff called the case number, and I watched him take in the fact that I wasn't alone, that I had a binder as thick as his attorney's, that I wasn't the woman who used to fold at the sound of his voice. Diane sat behind him. She didn't look at me once. Jenna wasn't there. She was 3 weeks postpartum and, according to a message she'd sent me the night before that I still hadn't fully processed, done being anyone's pawn. Russell Cade opened by painting the picture Wanda had warned me about. A family in crisis. A house sold out from under them. A pregnant woman and elderly mother left scrambling. A wife who'd vanished overseas without warning. Wanda let him finish. Then she stood up and, in a voice that didn't rise once, laid out Exhibit A through Exhibit F. The deed dated 2 years before the marriage. The prenuptial agreement Mark's own former attorney had witnessed. The forensic accounting showing over $70,000 moved without my knowledge across 18 months. The sheriff's department's active assault investigation. And finally, a certified transcript of the security footage timestamp log, which she did not play in open court. She didn't need to. The description alone made the magistrate's jaw tighten, but which she confirmed was formally entered into evidence in a separate criminal matter. "Your Honor," she said, "my client isn't the party who should be explaining herself to this court today." The magistrate denied the emergency freeze. Not because she was moved by our argument alone, I think, but because the moment she heard active criminal investigation for domestic assault attached to the same set of facts, the entire emotional frame Russell Cade had built collapsed under its own weight. You can't ask a court for sympathy about your housing situation while the woman you struck is sitting 12 feet away with a police case number. Mark didn't look at me on the way out. Diane did. Just once, in the hallway, a look that wasn't anger. It was something closer to disbelief. Like she genuinely could not process that the version of me who'd nodded and said, "You're right, I understand," had been capable of any of this. I held her gaze until she looked away first. The forensic case didn't stop at the hearing. That's the thing about pulling one thread on a man who's been unraveling for longer than you knew. You don't get to choose when it stops. Ray Dominick's fraud complaint against the HVAC company moved forward independently, and within 3 weeks, Mark was placed on unpaid leave pending an internal audit that Everett's report fed directly into. 6 weeks after that, Ray and Steve dissolved the partnership entirely, and Mark was formally terminated, cause listed as misappropriation misappropriation of company funds. I found out from a mutual friend, not from him. I hadn't spoken to him since the hearing. The affair, from a mutual friend, not from him. I hadn't spoken to him since the hearing. The affair, because it was an affair, it turned out, with a woman named Kristen who worked front desk at one of the hotels on the charge list, came out publicly in the ugliest way possible when Kristen's own husband found the same charges I had on a card of his own and showed up at the HVAC office before Mark had even been let go. There was a scene. Someone filmed part of it on their phone. It circulated in the small, gossip-hungry way things do, in a town where everyone's mother knows everyone else's mother. And within a month, Mark Whitfield wasn't a name people said neutrally anymore. The Batterers Intervention Program came with a court-appointed facilitator, a licensed counselor named Dr. Priscilla Ames, who Wanda told me, in an aside I hadn't asked for but was grateful to hear, ran one of the more rigorous programs in the county. No rubber stamping attendance, actual accountability work, actual homework Mark would have to complete or risk violating probation. I never found out whether he did the work honestly or just enough to check the box. Some part of me hoped, uselessly, that he did it honestly, not for me, for whoever came after me if anyone did. Detective Cole closed her portion of the file the same week the plea was entered, and she called me herself instead of letting the paperwork do it. Wanted you to hear it from a person, she said, not a form letter. I thanked her. I meant it more than the words could carry. Diane's role in all of it came apart more slowly, and honestly, more sadly than I expected to feel about her. It turned out the unhoused framing Russell Cade had pushed in court wasn't entirely a lie. Diane had, in fact, quietly co-signed a loan for Jenna's original apartment that Jenna could no longer afford once Corey moved out 6 months earlier, something Diane had been covering and hiding from everyone, including Mark, for months before she ever set foot in my kitchen. She hadn't moved Jenna into my house out of cruelty alone. She'd moved her in because she'd run out of other places to hide a problem she was too proud to admit she couldn't fix. That didn't excuse what she did. It just made it make a sadder kind of sense. The criminal case for the assault moved through the system the way these things do, slowly, with continuances, with a plea deal eventually offered and accepted rather than a trial, because the footage was, as Detective Cole predicted, about as clean a case as she'd seen in a while, and Mark's attorney knew a jury wouldn't need more than the tape and my testimony. He pled to a lesser domestic violence charge, got probation, a mandated batterers intervention program, and a permanent protective order I hadn't even had to fight for. The judge added it without my attorney asking twice. The divorce finalized 4 months after I landed in England. I kept every dollar from the house. Half of the recovered transfer funds, the ones that hadn't already been spent on hotel rooms and jewelry for a woman who wasn't me, came back to me through the settlement, structured by Wanda in a way that made sure none of it could be touched by any future claim from Diane or anyone else. I never filed anything against Diane directly. I thought about it. Priya thought I had grounds. Technically, given how deliberately she'd orchestrated the move-in, knowing what she knew about her own son. In the end, I decided I didn't need to win against a woman whose entire world had already come apart in front of her. The loan default became public in the same wave of gossip that took Mark's name down. Her son lost his business and his marriage and his reputation in the same 11 weeks, and Jenna, from what I heard through my mother's grapevine, stopped speaking to her mother almost entirely and moved in with Corey's parents instead, baby in tow, done being anyone's pawn like she'd promised. Jenna reached out to me once more, 5 months after the baby was born. Not an apology exactly. I don't think she owed me one. Not really. She'd been as steamrolled by Diane as anyone. But a message that said, simply, I named her Claire. I hope that's okay. You were the only one who ever actually stood up. I sat with that message for a long time in my little flat above the laundromat, the one that had started to feel less like a hiding place and more like an actual home, and I let myself cry properly for the first time since the plane. Not for Mark. Not even really for the house, though I'd loved it. My grandmother's roses still blooming somewhere in a garden that belonged to strangers now. I cried because somewhere in Ohio there was a baby with my name who would grow up never knowing what it was like to be told to watch her mouth. I wrote back, tell her when she's older that her name means someone who chose herself, and it worked out. It's been just over a year now. I still live in England. Priya became something closer to a friend than a solicitor somewhere around month 6, and last spring I started freelancing again. Compliance work for a firm in the city that doesn't know or care about any of this. I don't talk about the marriage much. When people ask why I moved continents alone with 2 suitcases, I've learned to give the short version and let the silence after it do the rest of the talking. I bought a small terraced house last winter. Nothing like my grandmother's. No roses. Just a strip of concrete out back I've been slowly turning into a garden I have no real talent for. My mother came out for Christmas and cried in the kitchen doorway. Not from sadness, she said, just from how much lighter I seemed, how I laughed with my whole face again instead of just the corners of my mouth. I hadn't noticed the difference in myself until she pointed it out. That's usually how it goes. You're the last one to see how far you've come because you were too busy walking. Sometimes I think about that first night, standing in my own kitchen with a split lip, nodding, saying, "You're right, I understand." And I used to think of it as the moment I lost. Now I know it was the only lie I ever told him that actually worked. He told me to watch my mouth. I watched the deed instead, and everything else came apart in the exact order it deserved to.